This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
At least one wrestling program is showing signs of hope and promise. It's not the second coming of Mid-South, but in comparison to most things I'm seeing these days, it's the best alternative out there. And all the while, I sit here, pounding my head against the table, wondering, how exactly did you think it would be a good idea to do a Raw retrospective series? No. It's like they all say. It sounded like a good idea at the time. It's like when they ask you, why did you nail your balls to the step stool? The answer is, I thought it was a good idea at the time. Trust me, it could be worse. It could be way worse. I could have decided to review the entire Nitro library. I don't think I would have made it past the end of 96. You know, that's something I actually never talked about on the channel before. My experience watching the Monday Night Wars and how I bounced from show to show. I did plenty of VHS recording, but I'm trying to remember the exact point where I switched gears with watching WCW and WWF live. I remember once they botched the Sting-Hogan feud at Starrcade. That's when I permanently switched over to watching Raw live. And then I quickly regretted that decision once I saw all of Russo's booking come to the forefront. But the turning point for me with Nitro was the Sting-Hogan thing. Because I remember we ordered that pay-per-view. My brothers were like super pro WCW at that point. As was I, because, well, that's what we watched live. We taped the Raws, but, you know, we'd always catch up on them a few days later because that was well before the Steve Austin-Vince McMahon feud blew up. And we weren't really all that interested in the Montreal Screwjob stuff because, you know, we always kind of suspected a lot of that was a work anyway. And I still, to this day, think it was mostly a work, but I'll save that discussion for another time. But, yeah, the Monday Night Wars. Good times. Back when being a wrestling fan was considered cool. But even as I go back and watch some of these Raws from the mid-90s again, I can tell you for sure, I don't feel cool after having watched them. I come out thinking people ought to point fingers at me and call me a dork for having subjected myself to such lame content. And we're only entering the dark period. It is a downhill slippery slope from this point forward. All the while, things are heating up here on Monday Night Raw. We're still about a month away from SummerSlam 94. And while Bret and Owen is the main title program they're building up to inside the cage, we've also got this $1 million corporation story going on right now. As of now, it's kind of taken center stage as the focal point of a lot of these Raws recently. So much so that even Owen and Bret are playing second fiddle to it. So far, we've been basically left with two cliffhangers. What's going on with the doppelganger Undertaker? And what's Lex Luger's relationship with Ted DiBiase? Those are the two main things they left us at the end of last week. And now, just in case you thought this storyline wasn't already patchy and all over the place to begin with. Now we're about to muddy the waters even more by throwing in Tatanka. He is now a central part of this storyline. Why? I don't know. But as of a recent episode of WWF Superstars, Tatanka is now pissed off at Luger for leaving everybody in the dark. Where does he stand with his relationship with Ted? Why isn't he giving any indication to where he stands? Well, he's impatient and he's sick of waiting. Tatanka is, for that matter. For the record, I have no memory of any of this stuff. I remember the Undertaker story vividly because that resulted in an infamously terrible match on pay-per-view. But as far as the whole Luger thing goes, it's like I'm watching some of this crap for the first time. It's so bad. And while that's all going on, their featured match for this show is Diesel versus Lex Luger for the IC title. When they announced this last week, I immediately prepped myself for the worst case scenario. The idea of Kevin Nash versus Lex Luger on paper. Whew. That's enough to send the kids running for the hills. And actually, a thought hit me while I was watching this. Had nothing to do with Luger or Diesel. But before I cover that thought, let me try to provide a breakdown of this match. Trying to keep in mind that this was still a semi-motivated Kevin Nash working at the time, I was cautiously hopeful that it wouldn't be, horrific. In all honesty, it wasn't that terrible. At worst, I would merely say it was boring. Again, this was back when Nash actually bothered to do more than 5 moves of doom, if you count the hair flip. Luger wasn't exactly a ring whiz, but, he could at least move and keep the pace up without bogging the action down to a complete halt. It was a big man match in the sense that they did a lot of power moves and standoff spots. Right up until the first commercial, they did a lot of stalling while Shawn was out on the floor trying to feed Diesel advice. Probably legitimately calling spots for him and telling him where to go because Nash was still very green here. I did right before their commercial pitch, they go to put the camera up in the nosebleed section of the building. I have no idea what they were filming. Might have been in the skybox area. But we see what appears to be a human silhouette looking on from way above the arena. Somehow, JR and the Macho Man were able to determine this was Ted DiBiase. Now, perhaps from their vantage point in the building, it was a little more clear. From the quality of the camera lens, the only thing I could see was gray matter and a shadow. But upon further review, I was able to eventually determine it was DiBiase. So we come back for some slow, plotty offense from Diesel. There was a long neck crank spot where even the cameramen got bored filming it. To the point that they had enough time to film Shawn on the floor explaining how hot it was in the building, as well as panning the camera around to JR and Savage, who are literally doing nothing. They were just putting over DiBiase. All of which was much more interesting than watching Diesel put Luger in a neck crank for 5 minutes. And after about another hour of watching Diesel work over Luger in various holds, Luger finally makes his comeback, the highlight of which was watching the hard cam shot, is every time Luger got a near fall or hit a big move on Diesel, we see Shawn either come flying into the frame overselling or bouncing up and down like a wild man pounding the ring apron. And eventually they do the ref bump spot out of the corner so Luger can get Diesel up in the modified torture rack. I say modified because it was more like a burning hammer rack. And while Luger's holding him up there on his shoulders, Shawn comes in, decks Luger with the sweet chin music, Both guys go down in a heap while Shawn tries to revive the ref. They do the slow, dramatic crawl where Diesel goes over to cover Luger, but that only gets 2. And while there's a Louisville slugger going on in the ring with Luger and Nash, out comes Razor Ramon to give chase to Shawn around the ring. And that evidently spills into the ring where the ref throws the match out. Double DQ. Funny seeing 3 of the 4 Click members involved here. Minus Hunter, obviously. It's just one of those things where you see Nash, Hall, and Shawn in the same ring together and your mind instantly goes there. Lame DQ finish aside, the match was 1,000 times better than I thought it would be. The period where Nash was working over Luger was a bit of a lull, but the crowd was hot for the Luger comeback, and all the stuff at the end when all 4 guys were in there fighting, they were into that. And then right as the heels were about to drop Razor with a stuffed pile driver, Luger runs in to stop them and sends Shawn and Diesel running. I did note here, with Shawn dropping Razor directly down on top of his head and nearly killing him, because Shawn was an unprofessional prick and didn't give a fuck. Beyond that, though, and I think this would probably be a good time to talk about the Shawn thing, because this is where it hit me. Now, keep in mind, for those that know your WWF history, in about 6 months from this point, January of 1995, Shawn Michaels is about to win the Royal Rumble match. He's about to headline WrestleMania 11 in less than a year's time for the world title. This guy has been a total afterthought in 1994. From the moment they took the IC title off of him, he's been totally shoehorned into the background. And I've said this countless times, I was by no means a Shawn Michaels fan around this point. WWF Shawn Michaels in the 1990s was nearly unbearable for me to watch, especially from 96 onward. But even so, the fact that this guy was about to get a monster singles babyface push in like a year's time, have they done anything to establish or tease the idea of that ever happening? You want to talk about the epitome of being a guy? Shawn Michaels was a guy in 1994. He was like bottom rung of the ladder irrelevant. It's almost astonishing when you go back and watch this. We all remember Shawn being one of the most heavily pushed guys in the WWF throughout the 90s. But then I'm rewatching this stuff and from 94 and I'm like, that cannot be further from the truth. This guy is a total background player. Now, I know the stuff with him and Diesel eventually takes off because there's the whole split and the setup for the Mania match next year, the Shawn turn, all that jazz. But looking at where he is now in the summer of 94, if I didn't know any better at the time, I'd have figured Vince gave up on him. People talking about the boyhood dream, I'd have been asking, what boyhood dream? So from there, we came back for a bunch of buffer matches. We go from that to Mabel versus Austin Steele. It was at that point that I regretted my comments about Nash being borderline immobile. Here's everything I wrote down about it. Hideously boring. Mabel won with a boss man slam in 2 minutes. I vaguely remember watching this on Friday night and getting a massive eye irritation midway through. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe it was God stepping in and saying, go rinse your face off and stop watching this horrible match. It wasn't long enough to entirely blind me, although they were really pushing it there. That was followed with a SummerSlam card update with Todd Pettingill. And I think I've reached my boiling point with these Todd segments in the WWF. I can't even stomach the ability to sit through any of these anymore. He's so obnoxiously Caucasian, it's not even funny. The only thing I noted here were his comments on the Owen-Brett cage match, where he asked Savage and JR if they believe the cage is going to be enough to keep the Hart family away from ringside, to which Savage said, "That's impossible, because there's already going to be approximately, quote, 1,684,362 hearts at ringside," unquote. Whether or not he pulled that number out of his ass on the spot, that's amazing enough. But I like the idea how that only accounts for the Hart family and not the remainder of the people in attendance. So I guess we'd have to triple that number for the United Center in Chicago. That's a pretty big crowd. Then Owen Hart wrestled Reno Riggins, obviously still accompanied by Jim Neidhart, who was serving as Owen's muscle/mentor during this period. Decent little squash. Heel Owen is the best. I can't stress that enough. The anvil was great on the floor, giving him the bug-eyed look, telling him to dismantle this piece of crap and show him no mercy. And Owen beat him up for a few minutes and won with the sharpshooter. Not a whole lot else to say about it. We did, however, get a brief plug for the 2 featured matches on next week's program. And boy, am I going to sleep tight at night knowing what's coming in the not-so-distant future. This one will leave you watering at the mouth. It actually made me start craving a best-of-7 series with Luger and Diesel. Because I think I would rather see those guys wrestle again than watch Adam Bomb wrestle Yokozuna. Let me repeat that. Adam Bomb versus Yokozuna. Oh my God. That sounds fucking horrendous. Brian Clark, the former member of Chronic, wrestling a singles match with fat, out-of-shape, unmotivated Yokozuna. That is what they are hyping up for next week's program. Get the booze ready. Because if you survive that calamity, you'll also get to see Tatanka versus Nikolai Volkov. Well past his prime, Nikolai Volkov. That's the caveat. Were they trying to actively run people off? What is going on here? Bret Hart is your top champion right now. You had the 1-2-3 Kid have probably the best singles match of his entire career up to that point. And your bright idea to book 2 featured matches on TV next week is to do Adam Bomb versus Yokozuna and Tatanka versus Nikolai Volkov. That is what you came up with? I refuse to believe they weren't trying to run people off. That is beyond reproach. That is an outright rib. They are daring people to not watch. But you know what? They did. As bad as business was, more people were watching that than they are watching wrestling today. So what can you do? Speaking of ribs, I'm convinced the next match was a rib. Spark Plug Bob Holly versus George South. The epitome of filler this was. This was one of those buffer matches where they looked around and said, all of the top guys are out right now. Who is standing closest to Gorilla right now and can go out and stall for time? And someone found Sparky Plug hanging around the water cooler and told him to go out and wrestle for a few minutes. I also had very little to say about this. It was short, they did a few spots, And then Bob Holly eventually won with a crossbody dive. At which point, we come back for a contextual breakdown of The Undertaker's 1994 timeline, wherein we were reminded that the last time the real Undertaker was seen on camera, it was inside the confines of a casket at the Royal Rumble back in January. At which point, after he ascended into heaven, and then we were graced with a series of horrible vignettes where ordinary common people were walking around claiming that they had seen The Undertaker in public settings. Now, of course, we don't actually see Taker, but we're just supposed to take it at face value that these people weren't crazy. That The Undertaker was randomly showing up in parks or schools or fucking subways. Not the train stations, like actual sandwich places. Did Subway exist in the mid-90s? How long has that franchise been around? I'm curious now. Goes to show how much I know about my chain restaurants. Holy mother of God, they've been around since the 1960s. Wow. Yeah, they were around. They were definitely around. Anyway, not making any of that up, by the way. These are real segments that they filmed and aired. And now we're led to believe that The Undertaker had returned, seemingly from out of nowhere, now affiliated with Ted DiBiase and the $1 Million Corporation because, well, Ted bought him off, essentially. But it turns out that Paul Bearer is also hiding something. He knows what's really going on underneath the surface. This Undertaker that DiBiase brought in, it's obviously not the real Undertaker. And at SummerSlam, Paul plans on revealing the real Taker. The real Mark Calloway. We're going to see him back into the fold. Yeah, gonna be honest. This is a weird fucking storyline. How they got from point A to point D is quite odd. I mean, when you really look at it, basically it boils down to this. The Undertaker died. He rose from the dead. People claimed to see the real Undertaker in broad daylight. Ted went out of his way to bring in a fake Undertaker to fuck around with everybody. And now Paul Bearer is about to bring in the real Undertaker at SummerSlam to wrestle Ted's phony Taker. The imposter Taker. That's the story. That is what they're building to. It is either incredibly stupid, incredibly genius, or just so on beyond all comprehension, all you can do is just roll with it. You just nod your head and say, cool. Because that's kind of where I'm at. It's creatively outrageous. But you know, I've seen so much stupid shit in wrestling throughout my life. I can't even argue that this would rank somewhere in the top 10 of the most stupid shit I've ever seen. Maybe top 20, because it's pretty bad. But there have been far worse storylines. How in the fuck I managed to fall in love with The Undertaker as a kid is beyond me. My favorite wrestler of all time. I make no bones about it. But goddamn was he involved in a lot of stupid shit. So then we had Bam Bam Bigelow versus Gary Sabaw, aka the Italian Stallion. Also, according to JR's expertise, the world's spaghetti-eating champion. Because, you know, he's Italian. It says so on his ring trunks. Another case where the announcers spend more time name-dropping celebrities and talking about stuff that had nothing to do with the actual match. Bam Bam won with the power slam. And then before our show concluded, we had JR trying to get the insider scoop with DiBiase about Luger's status. All throughout the program, We were led to believe that it was a done deal. Luger signed on the dotted line. He was now a part of the corporation with DiBiase. But we need confirmation from the leader of the group. So, Ted does a roundabout way of blowing off the revelation. Says that we'll have to wait until Superstars that weekend for the big announcement. Meanwhile, here comes Tatanka to get in DiBiase's face and tell him that he's seen the money and he knows what DiBiase is trying to hide. So he should just come out right now and admit that DiBiase bought off Luger and Luger sold out. However, DiBiase tells Tatanka that he's just jealous that he didn't offer Tatanka his services. He even goes as far as to tell him that he can't beat Luger, and he's willing to bet money on it. He's even willing to bet 10 grand that Tatanka can't beat Nikolai next week on television. And Tatanka willingly accepts that bet. Apparently under the impression that Ted's going to live up to his word. Guess we'll see. But, there's your SummerSlam program, more or less. Luger and Tatanka. I have no memory of that match happening either. Just compile that on the list of stuff that I completely neglected to remember about WWF during this period. God, is this $1 Million Corporation story all over the map. It's bad. Don't get me wrong. Ted's trying to salvage it where he can by doing his best to apply logic. God love him, he's trying, but I don't know if it's working. And we're only in the beginning stages. This $1 Million Corporation story, do you know how long this group goes on for? Do you know how long this faction exists? Well into 96. 2 more years of this. My God. And you look at how the history of this whole faction and how it started. Didn't it begin with the Nikolai thing months ago? Somehow we've now escalated to Luger, and none of it's made any sense. We got people coming in as team members, and it's not really explained how or why. People are on the fence. Ted's trying to buy people out of their contracts. It's like the most random conglomeration of people in this group right now. And it only gets more muddled from there. Now we're throwing Tatanka in there. It's awful. Much like how the show is pretty awful. My God, next week only seems like it's going to be that much worse. The sink is shipping. We're about to enter the dark stages of WWF as we approach 95. And I'm just thinking, how on earth am I going to get through all that? How are we going to make it to Austin and Vince? Time warp. That's how. I mean, it may not seem that far out, but with the way these retro Raw shows have been going, it may as well be a lifetime. All right then. Should we talk about SmackDown? I know we're all frothing at the mouth to get this done and over with. Well, I guess we could start here. That Bloodline marathon that ran last week for like 2/3 of the show. All that stuff that was dedicated to Jey Uso and Roman Reigns. That wasn't the story this week. We got some follow-up, but it was definitely a less heavy Bloodline show. Which is bad news for me, since the Bloodline is like the only thing I usually look forward to every week on this show. And judging by their TV ratings, I know I'm not alone in that. Well, we did not start off with a 45-minute Bloodline segment. This time we started off with Bianca Belair coming out for a promo. Skipping and prancing, twirling, and booty shaking her way all the way down to the ring for a promo. I'm not entirely sure what her outfit was supposed to be, but it was Quite exploitive. Perhaps a little too see-through, if you know what I mean. The first thing I actually wrote down here, they're really lucky she's hot. Anyway, well, the big main event for the program was Bianca and Asuka for the women's title. The rematch, I guess. A match that Bianca says she's been impatiently waiting for since like May. She's talking about all the ridiculous hoops she's had to jump through just to even get Adam Pearce to sign off on the rematch. And it's so strange because I'm listening to her do this promo, and she's going off on this really bitchy tangent about how she's entitled to a rematch. She's been overlooked for the last 2 months. And I'm like, this is a really self-entitled douchey promo Bianca's cutting right now. It's almost a little too heelish. And I know I've been speculating on the idea that they may be going in that booking direction and how turning Bianca heel might not actually be a bad thing. Listening to her do this promo, it's the one thing that stood out to me above anything else. My God, she's sounding super heelish right now. And then I started remembering back when Bianca was a bitchy heel in NXT, and I said, yeah, those were fun times. She was actually really good at being a villain. But of course, she ends up getting interrupted by Charlotte, who decided to come out not looking like a fish this time. This time, I don't even know what the hell that jumpsuit was she was wearing. She looked like a vase. Or some kind of fancy wallpaper design. Whoever picks these outfits for the girls does a horrible job. These scampy, skin-tight outfits. And they're never attractive looking. Anyway, now this is where I kind of just tapped out trying to pay attention, if I'm being honest. Charlotte's out there bumbling over herself on the mic, because she sucks. They're basically trying to establish that once Bianca beats Asuka, it's going to be Charlotte and Bianca for the title at SummerSlam. So immediately you already knew it was going to be a three-way. Before the bell even fucking rang from the main event. That's how predictable this all was. This went on for like 8 minutes. I have no idea why. It literally would not end. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. They're talking and talking and talking and talking. Slowly killing the crowd with each passing line. And then finally Charlotte wooed her and left. It was like the best part of it. We were 10 minutes into the show, and I was already over it. And then after that ruckus hot start, they pitched back to the ring for a Brawling Brutes versus Suspect Sissies tag match. And I just kept my finger on the fast forward button for another 12 minutes until it was over. The crop top Cretans won with a top rope leg drop. Goody goody. And then following a short VTR, covering all the Bloodline story from last week with the tribal court stuff, we were now basically a half hour into the show, and I was seriously contemplating if I'd have been better off watching Rampage instead. And then I actually looked at the Rampage results and decided against it. By the way, before I move on here, I wrote this down because it was so preposterous sounding. After the Bloodline video, Michael Cole and Wade Barrett gave a medical update on the status of Jimmy Uso. Because remember, he got carted off in an ambulance last week. They said he'll be out for the foreseeable future with, medical term mind you, ruptured rib cartilage. Howled with laughter. Couldn't you say severe rib injury? No, they had to use a WWE-ism. So, well, then we had Charlotte teasing she was about to leave the building until Bayley and Io showed up and basically threatened to cash in the briefcase later on. So Charlotte decided to stay. Which was very weird. Why would she give a fuck? The main event is Asuka versus Bianca for the belt. Why would Charlotte care who the champion is? I'm just asking. Does she really want to wrestle Bianca that badly? I don't know what's going on. All the while, Adam Pearce just kind of stood there like a dolt and didn't utter a word the entire time. He's the general manager of this program, correct? In kayfabe, I know this is fake, but bear with me here. He's the boss, right? He's the one that calls the shots. Was he seriously about to let Charlotte just up and leave under her own accord? All because she felt like it? Why? Because she's Charlotte Flair, so she thinks she earns special privilege? If I were Adam, I'd have looked Charlotte square in the tits and said, fuck you. I'm paying you to show up to work. You're going to hang around for the rest of the show and watch from the back. Not leaving early, you dipshit. What is it with this generation of young, stupid people thinking they can just do and say whatever they want without consequences? Where are all the old school boomers out there to put these Gen Zers in their place? Dye your hair a normal color. Get those piercings out of your face. Go to the gym. God, people piss me off. No wonder I identify with old school people more. Now, to be fair, I think Charlotte's a late millennial. Still, they're equally as bad. I think I technically count as a late millennial. Let's see, 87, is that part of the late millennial generation? I don't even know. I have to look it up. I probably could have looked it up while this Zelina Vega-Bailey match was going on. What I was actually doing while this match was going on was taking a dump. I literally left the room for 90 seconds, came back, and when I walked in the room, Zelina was spanking Bailey with a flip-flop, and I immediately went back to take a shit again. I was so disgusted. Bailey won. Somehow. I don't know. I don't care. I also don't care that she's lugging around a piece of Botchy's green hair. Because if that means I'm going to have to watch a Bailey Botch-Z match at some point, I'll make sure I reserve that time for the world's longest bathroom break. So here we were about 45 minutes into the show when Jey Uso came out to do a promo. And never in a million years would I have thought that I would be craving a fucking Jey Uso promo of all things. But God, dude. With the direction this show was headed, I needed something. At least I knew it would tie into the Bloodline somehow. You know, even if Roman wasn't there to make a physical appearance. And albeit, the promo wasn't exactly earth-shattering. Can't deny the fact that the people are really digging Jey as a babyface right now. Even the hand-select group of jack-offs that tried to start a what chant during his promo. 3 seconds in. Fucking retards. Anyway, he basically called out the fact that he respects the family dynasty, but when it comes to Roman Reigns, he doesn't respect a damn thing. Says that Solo has an ass whooping coming his way as well. And Paul Heyman's been manipulating the Samoan dynasty for well over 40 years. And it stops with... Hold on, I'm trying to say this without coming off like a condescending douchebag. Main event, Jey Uso. No. Not feeling it. Not feeling main event Jey Uso. But he tried. So anyway, here comes Wally the Walrus, aka Paulie Dangerously, alongside Solo. Is it Solo Sikoa or just Solo now? I can't remember the last time they actually said Sikoa on television, so I just presume we're going with the first name only. Think Vince is hanging around? Anyway, so they waddle down to the ring. Heyman's out there pointing the blame at Jay for everything that went down with Jimmy last week. The reason Jimmy's cooped up in that hospital bed right now is all because of Jay's actions. And he's not the only one that will never forgive Jay for what he did. His mother, his father, his brothers, everybody is disappointed and will never forgive Jay. Even the tribal chief Roman. And, well, Solo grabbed the mic. And he delivers a line that he'll never forgive Jay either. And that is when I wrote down, I like it a lot better when Solo just stands there as a mute. Because whenever he talks, I'm reminded of why he sounds better quiet. His voice. My God. Doesn't match the look. Not at all. There's no bass. He just... Nah. Everything's mid-level range with him. So anyway, as expected, this quickly broke down. Solo and Jay are going at it for a while. And, well, they basically milked two angles here. The first was Jay getting a chance to hit Paulie with a super kick, which he kind of did. Didn't connect anywhere close to his face. And Heyman sold it like Randy on the Christmas Story whenever he gets knocked into the snow with like 8 layers of coats on. Rolling around and twisting on his hips. Basically pretending like he can't get up. It was quite amusing. He looked like a fucking cockroach getting flipped over onto its back and then desperately trying to flip itself back over onto its legs. And the other thing they milked here was Jay trying to go after Paul with a chair. Of course, that wasn't ever going to happen. But it was after Solo took the bullet here where I realized, am I the only one that's thinking Solo is doing way too much selling lately? Like, it's one thing to see him get knocked off his feet or thrown out of the ring in some capacity. But we've been seeing Solo take a lot of bumps lately. And it's kind of ruining the mystique of him being the muscle of the bloodline. Like, a big powerhouse like that should only be taking bumps sparingly for big occasions. Like, elsewise, he just kind of comes off like an ordinary guy. I know they don't have many options right now because the bloodline basically has 3 people in it. And Roman wasn't there. And Lord knows Paul Heyman's going to take a bump more than he needs to. But, I don't know, Solo just got punked out like a complete schlub in this segment. Just took a brutal beating from Jay here. They need to protect him better than they are because it's going to get to a point where if we start seeing Solo become the bloodline's punching bag too regularly, by the time they decide to split him away from Roman and push him as a singles guy, he's not going to have much of an appeal. I mean, he ought to be like Goldberg, where he just smashes through everybody and rarely sells. You know, that way when he does sell for the bigger stages, it actually means something. Maybe it's just me, but I think he's been taking way too many bumps lately. As for the segment as a whole, I mean, they're certainly trying. I can't discredit them for trying to run with the Jey Uso thing. I don't think you're going to get enough people on board to buy the idea that they're actually going to put the strap on him. But he definitely serves as a quality placeholder opponent for Roman, especially as they're trying to ramp up next year's WrestleMania. I think the problem evidently becomes, what do you do with the Usos after SummerSlam? Once Roman beats Jay and moves on, where does that leave the Usos? That's always the problem in scenarios like this, where the babyface doesn't win the big one in the end. How do you keep them over without completely cutting their legs out? Sammy was like the hottest babyface in this company back in January or February this year when they were building up for that big title match with Roman in Montreal. Yeah, after Sammy lost, yeah, they put the tag straps on him and Owens in Mania, but what's the road for them been like since? Sure, the people still like them, but especially with Sammy, is he as over to the same degree he was like 6 months ago? When he was right in the middle of this bloodline stuff and the people were popping for everything he did? I don't even think it's close. So what happens with Jimmy and Jay after the dust settles? Did they just go back to being ordinary mid-card Usos? How do you keep them white hot? It's something to consider as we see the fallout from SummerSlam. I don't really have a vested interest in seeing those guys as a tag team again. I've been complaining about that for months. But then again, what other options do you have? So after that, we have one of my favorite tropes in modern wrestling. Random multi-man matches for no reason, thrust into the middle of the show with zero hype. It is a number one contenders four-way, with the winner eventually getting a title shot against Austin Theory. Presumably at SummerSlam, although I don't think that was ever specified. And actually, I don't even think that's entirely accurate with the way I described that. I think it's one of two four-ways they're going to be doing, where after the four-ways conclude, they're going to then do a one-on-one match with the winners of said four-ways to crown an actual number one contender. Got all that? Did I confuse you enough? Because they have to overcomplicate shit to the point where it's just beyond ridiculous. And because of the state of WWE star power these days, here were the four options we were dealt. What you would call the best they could come up with as quality contenders for the United States title. AJ Styles. Okay, fine. Butch of the Brawling Brutes. At best, an underneath flunky. Santos Escobar, the second-tier frontrunner in the LWO. And Grayson fucking Fodder, a guy that has wrestled one match on this show and lost. Those were the options we had. And of course, it's a goddamn four-way. So it's every four-way you've ever seen in the last decade. They did a bunch of spots. What else do you need to know? They did stuff. Moves. That's all it was. It was a series of moves. We got the predictable stacked up stupidplex spot with all four guys, because they have to do that in every modern match. I'm sure we'll see it next week when they do the other four-way. No, but this time they modified it. It was a sunset flip double superplex spot. It wasn't as impressive as it sounds. And finally at the end, after everyone did a bunch of dives out to the floor, AJ tried to set up Butch for a Styles clash, but is then conveniently interrupted by Karrion Kross showing up on the Jumbotron, putting one of the bald egg jobbers in a chokehold. It took me like 10 seconds to recognize it was Carl Anderson. I just thought it was some geek running the popcorn stand. That's how generic those two idiots look. And of course, AJ, well, he's a fucking Nimrod, so he just bails and walks to the back. Because he doesn't give a fuck. Why would he? And of course, he ends up getting blindsided by Grayson in the aisleway, where immediately Grayson turns around, he runs full speed into the ring, leaps through the bottom rope, and then catches Butch with a stunner. I believe that was the move he tried to set up on Edge last week but failed. I think the announcers called that his finish. Now that I have seen that move executed in full, I can now confidently sit here and say, that move fucking sucks and it needs to go. It is overly complex and phony beyond belief. Not only does it bury him, but it buries the guy that has to stand there and wait for him to set up the spot. If you think I'm kidding, I'm not. Go watch the clip. This is apparently his finishing move that he was using in NXT for all those months. This is how he was winning his matches. A 50-yard dash from the aisleway into the ring where he flips through the bottom rope, does a somersault up to his feet, and then hits the guy with a stunner. Huh? And that's taking into account the fact that the guy is standing there in position to take a stunner. What happens if his back is turned? Does it become a modified neck breaker? Who signed off on that? That is one of the dumbest moves I've seen in the last 10 years. That's almost as insulting as the Canadian Destroyer. Fuck, that move's horrible. Well, it didn't matter because Escobar just ended up winning with the splash anyway. That is 2 straight pinfalls that Waller's eaten in 2 consecutive weeks. Good. I think I really am just going to start calling him Grayson Fodder. Because if this losing streak continues, what else do you call him? He is essentially job fodder. But, yeah, like I said, I think that sets up Escobar versus the winner of next week's Multi-Man. And they shot some pre-tapes with Rey Mysterio, Sheamus, and Cameron Grimes. They all pitched their case for why they would make quality U.S. champions. Glad to see Grimes isn't dead. Where the fuck's that guy been? You know, I'll be honest with you. They actually kind of have me conflicted right now because among those 3 men competing next week in the 4-way, you've also got LA Knight being added to the mix. So now I have to pick and choose between Grimes and Knight to go over. That's a tough one. Maybe they can just do a double pin and they both get the title shot. And then they can tell Escobar to eat shit and hang out in catering. Speaking of LA Knight, he got some promo time this week. And, yeah. No, that's it. I have nothing else to say. They got it over. After all these years, they finally found the one chant that could replace the what chant. Poor Jay was getting the what chant earlier on. Not LA Knight. He was getting, yeah, chants. I couldn't believe it. That's something he needs to run with from like every promo from now until the end of time. Literally, in like 90 seconds of TV, he was the biggest star on the entire show, going out there and talking about how the people are using his name and talking about him getting over big on social media. People claim he's the megastar or the GOAT. But what everyone will soon be able to call him is Champ. Yeah.
Yeah! Yeah!
Because everybody knows whose game it is. What else needs to be said? I think we've established who needs to win the fucking U.S. title at SummerSlam. And you know what the best part of this is? I'm pretty sure this was supposed to be a babyface promo. If you actually go back and listen to it, there wasn't anything heelish about it. He wasn't telling the fans to pipe down or shut up. He wasn't admonishing anybody or putting anybody down. It was all about him pleading his case for why he's going to walk into SummerSlam and become the new U.S. champ. Now, sure, LA Knight's always going to have the brash, cocky attitude. It's kind of part of the gimmick. He's always going to sound edgy with his delivery, but as far as the material goes, it sounded like a babyface promo to me. So maybe they are finally going to run with it. Stop going against the grain and just run with the babyface LA Knight thing. I kind of like the idea of him versus Theory at SummerSlam. That could be a damn good match. You know, and if the plan is to swap the belt over tonight and then freshen up the mid-card scene a little bit, I'd be all for it. Why not? I mean, no offense to Theory, but he hasn't done jack shit with that title. Keeping it on him isn't moving the needle in any way. LA Knight is at least somebody that the people care about right now. And you already know how electric that room is going to be if Knight beats Theory and wins the belt. Talk about a surefire way to blow the roof off the arena. They may as well just book that as the main event, because nothing's going to follow that reaction. Now, I'm sure they'll fuck it up because it's WWE. I mean, look at the track record. They've been fucking with LA Knight for the last 7 to 8 months. The right booking call would obviously be to put the strap on him and then run with him as a full-fledged babyface on SmackDown. And that's bearing in mind he's able to keep the smash mouth in-your-face gimmick. I don't think they need to modify his personality in any way. That would be stupid. Trying to make him more fan-friendly. No. He needs to be LA Knight. He needs to let the fans chant his catchphrases with him. Don't change anything about him aside from just running with the crowd reaction. As long as they're not trying to go against the grain and have him fight the crowd by pretending to be a heel, they're making steps in the right direction. Now, granted, I hate the idea of having to watch LA Knight work a clusterfuck 4-way next week. But if he wins, it's going to bring him one step closer to that title shot. So then we had our main event, with not a whole lot of runtime left in the show, mind you. It's Bianca and Asuka for the women's title. Not the Raw or the SmackDown women's title anymore, just the women's title. So whatever belt Rhea currently has on Raw, I guess that one just doesn't count. Maybe they're calling it the Divas title again. God, remember when WWE had that god-awful ugly belt all those years? That stupid pink butterfly-looking thing? And they carried it loud and proud for well over a decade, actually putting stock into that championship and thinking it meant a goddamn thing. But you know what? I'll say this. As hideous as that belt was, it stood out compared to today's titles, where every belt looks exactly the same, just with different colors. So, they're doing this match. It's okay. But of course, I'm basically just sitting there counting down the clock until they get to the finish, because you got Io, Bayley, and Charlotte hanging out at ringside watching. So you know something's going to happen. There's obviously going to be some kind of screwy finish. Sure enough, wouldn't you know it, Bayley and Io just casually hop the barricade, as does Charlotte. They all end up getting into a brawl on the floor, right in front of the official. Of course, that's not a DQ. But after Io dodges a spear and Charlotte takes out Bianca, that is when Jessica Carr calls for the bell. And the closing angle for the show is Io teasing that she's about to cash in on Asuka, but she ends up misting Bayley in the face with her Jolly Rancher food coloring, and then she leaves with the belt. Curious question, and I mean this genuinely. Who the fuck are the babyfaces and the heels here? I'm pretty sure Bayley and Io are heels. I think Bianca is still a babyface. Charlotte, I think, is still a babyface. Asuka, by the end of this, I don't know what the hell she is. I mean, she left two heels looking like idiots. So, I don't know. This is so fucking lame. But honestly, I can't even really poon it. Because once Charlotte got involved in the opener and interrupted Bianca's promo, I mean, you could see that main event finish coming a mile away. It sucks how they have to throw Charlotte into the middle of this thing. Yet again, going back to the well with the lazy booking triple threat deal, because that never gets old. I mean, I'm ambivalent either way. EO lurking around with the briefcase is a little interesting. You know, that's kind of the benefit of having a Money in the Bank holder on the show, because you never know when to expect them to show up and fuck over the champion. I mean, EO definitely should win the title at some point, because I think the people would actually like seeing that. You know, that match he had with Bianca earlier this year was like one of the best women's matches I've seen in a long time in either company. Yes, doing the heel cash-in is kind of tiresome and overdone, where the heel waits for the champ to be half dead before they can swoop in and steal the belt. But then again, I mean, you got Damian Priest on Raw right now with the men's briefcase. I don't see them doing the chicken shit sleazy heel cash-in with him. They could, but it doesn't seem as likely with a guy like Priest. EO, I could at least see them doing that just because of how her and Bayley are interacting on the show right now. It'd be fucking amazing if she cashed in right as Charlotte was about to reach her crowning achievement of 16-time title holder. That'd be the biggest stiff arm WWE could give her. God, it would be epic. Shove that middle finger right up the sphincter hole. But, now we'll see what they do. The show mostly sucked, but, you know, after everything they did last week with Roman and the Bloodline, you kind of had to expect there was going to be a bit of a drop-off this week. Right now, I'm just kind of waiting to see how the rest of the SummerSlam card unfolds. The wiki page, last I checked, didn't even have a single match announced yet. But, I mean, they've been teasing several things since Money in the Bank. I can't imagine that's deliberate on their part to keep most of these matches a secret. On the SmackDown end, and there's not a whole lot grabbing my attention at the moment. Outside the Roman J stuff, possibly LA Knight winning the United States title. Elsewise, the Blue brand doesn't have a whole lot going for it right now. I might be relying on Raw to kind of pique my interest for this card. But in terms of things that are actually piquing my interest at the moment, now's as good a time as any to run down this AEW Collision show. We're about 4 weeks into this thing now. A couple bumps in the road along the way, including that rating they did over the July 4th weekend, which was, not too hot. But again, I'm going to keep reiterating this so that people don't fall under the assumption that I'm trying to blow smoke or pump this show up as a monumental success. But for the kind of wrestling that I enjoy, for the kind of wrestling that AEW promised they were going to bring since day one and never lived up to that word, that being sports-based wrestling, this is probably the closest they've come to delivering on that promise. The shows are far from perfect, and the jury is still out on whether or not this is a long-term project that the network is going to want to cling on to. But for where we are now in the timeline, God, especially with the junk I'm being fed on those Wednesday night shows more often than not, this is probably the only modern wrestling show that I look forward to every week. Dynamite I normally dread because I know what to expect by now. SmackDown, unless it's Bloodline related, I'm usually either mentally checked out or half-heartedly watching most of that program. But with Collision, it's the one show that doesn't outright insult my intelligence. I'm not a fan of everything I see, but I at least take away something of value after the show's over. I don't get the sense that I wasted my time. In just 3 or 4 episodes, they've already got a handful of great matches under their belt. Ones that I would consider listing in my top 20 matches of 2023 when I put that video together in December. And again, it's the kind of wrestling that I prefer to watch. For the most part, everyone's serious. There's no intentional hokey comedy. No one's play acting. No one's trying to jab forks into people's eyeballs or going around slicing open arteries for no apparent reason. For the most part, it's a professionally written and professionally formatted wrestling show. And as I've been saying for a long time on this channel, that's what matters to me the most as a fan. I just want a product that treats pro wrestling like an authentic sport, much like it was treated during the territory days. I don't need to watch WCW 2.0, which is basically what Dynamite has turned into, or in some cases, low-rent WWF comedy skit knockoffs. And when it comes to sports-based wrestling and treating the business like a serious profession, nothing further exemplifies that than how they opened the show this week. The 2 out of 3 falls match for the AEW World Tag Titles. FTR versus Juice Robinson and Jay White, round 2. Last week, they tore the house down in that tournament eliminator deal where if Jay and Juice won, they were granted a title shot out of it. And while, yes, I had some reservations about the idea of them basically hot-shotting this rematch on free television 7 days after they just did the first match, at least they're giving us stable reasons to keep coming back to watch the Saturday shows every week. And yeah, it's a stipulation match. It's a gimmick match by its own right. But there's a reason for doing it. It's not just doing a gimmick match for the sake of doing a gimmick match. And how about that match, huh? Good Lord, where to even start? I know I say that after most AEW marathon runs, but God, there's so much to unpack here. I honestly don't know how to get from point A to point Z without going around my leg to get around my elbow. Well, I guess we can just start with this. This match was fucking great. And how timely is it, too? You think FTR went into this with a chip on their shoulder? Several days removed from that Chris Van Vliet interview with Dave Meltzer, where he's out there bumbling over himself and trying to justify in his own head how he comes up with his convoluted, nonsensical star rating system, where somehow the Beta Bucks and Omega wind up getting multiple 5-star matches awarded to them by basically going out there and doing a bunch of choreographed parkour for 30-plus minutes. FTR turned that around and said, "Fuck you, Dave. We're going to go out there and not only double that time, but we're going to go out there and have one of the best AEW tag matches in company history." Man. And that's certainly not to dismiss Jay and Juice from the conversation, because those guys earned that ovation by the end of this. And it's why part of me is always going to wonder whether or not they'd have been better off saving this match to do at Wembley. Because if you thought the crowd reaction here in Calgary was electric, just imagine double that crowd reaction with a super amped UK crowd that's getting a first-hand viewing experience of AEW's product. I mean, people would have been setting off pyro in the parking lot. That's how much this match would have gotten over in that building. I mean, they certainly had a point to prove. Again, you knew with it being 2 out of 3 falls, it was going to go long. How long was the obvious question. But it was all about pacing. And the thing with 2 out of 3 falls is that while, yes, there's usually a modern formula that comes to these matches with how they're laid out, both teams trading 1 fall apiece and then going to the sudden death round, not always, but most of the time that turns out to be the case. And they pretty much stuck to that same model here, but there were twists and turns along the way, so it wasn't so predictable. You know, the first fall didn't even come until well over 15 minutes into the match. So already I knew this was probably going to bleed well into hour 2 by the end of it. Early on, it's all FTR in the driver's seat, for the most part. You know, they're working some mind game trickery on the heels, trying to beat them at their own game. It wasn't a one-sided beatdown or anything, but you had Dax and Cash firmly in control for a lot of the offense. The heels are mostly fighting from behind and trying to figure out how to gain the leverage. And it all eventually built to a fantastic first pin, and I can't put over how great this was. It was so good, I'd have argued they should have probably saved this for the third fall. They did something similar to last week where they had that four-way miscommunication spot where FTR were going for the big rig, or whatever they're calling it now. I guess it's the Shatter Machine. But yet the heels cut them off and then block the finish so they could turn it around in their favor. Well, with the way they did this, it looks so fluid. Even though the idea was to make it look kind of chaotic and out of control. So FTR go for the Shatter Machine, but Juice shoves Cash so he inadvertently bumps Dax. Dax gets knocked out of the ring to the floor, so Juice can deliver a left jab to Cash. And then Jay grabs Cash and plants him with a Blade Runner. 1, 2, 3. It all happened in rapid succession, but it was so well done. Right at the point where the fans were really picking up the energy in the room, too. While it put the heels up 1-0 before the break, it left everybody with a suspenseful pitch because now we're left wondering how FTR are going to bounce back. And of course, they come back with the heels working over the baby faces for a long, extensive heat spot. This is the part of the match where they did probably my favorite sequence in the entire match. And this was after Dax got the hot tag and got to run wild for a little bit. But all throughout the second part of the match here, there was a story going on. FTR were getting all kinds of big double team and big moves. They had a nice tribute to Jay Briscoe where they hit Jay White with a Razor's Edge neckbreaker combo. I think the Briscoes used to use that move regularly in their matches. But the problem was, every time they went for something big, and every time the people thought that would have been a decisive finish, the heels would kick out or break up the fall somehow. And in fact, it got so much heat at one point, the fans were actually healing poor Paul Turner out there. I think people tried to start a "We Want Aubrey" chant, which was fucking hilarious. But it was a nice lingering story, planting that seed of doubt in everybody's mind that, with FTR already down a fall, they're yet to score a pin over Jay or Juice in any capacity. So is the idea that they just can't beat them? And that's when it really started hitting me when I'm watching this. I'm like, man, they might actually do a title swap here and have Jay and Juice go up 2 straight falls over FTR. I don't know if that would have been the right call, but it certainly could have led to a cool story down the road if they ever wanted to revisit this for a third match. My favorite spot in the whole match, though, they do a deal where Dax and Cash are going for that superplex splash combo, and Dax hits Jay with the suplex, but when Cash comes down for the splash, Jay gets the knees up, and then from literally out of nowhere, Juice comes barreling in with a splash of his own onto Dax, and he basically throws Jay on top of Dax's limp body, and that's when I said, oh, that's got to be it. But then Dax kicked out, and I was like, yeah, they're really about to go an hour on this thing. But the amazing thing is that we were only well into the first fall when the fans were starting "This is awesome" and AEW chants. We're maybe a little more than halfway through the match. But the people got into this thing. And they stayed with it, though. A few minutes later, FTR hit their finish on Juice. That evened everything up at 1 apiece. It was a great way to cap off that whole sequence. Again, the problem is we still had a third fall to go, and I was wondering how the fuck they were supposed to top anything in that middle portion when the fans were probably the hottest. And of course, they come back with trying to shoot the angle on the floor. Dax and Jay basically take a tumble over the barricade onto the concrete. And that's when they bring over Doc Samson to check on them. And I'll be honest, that was probably my biggest gripe about the match looking back. I thought that part was unnecessary and just kind of detracted from the match in a negative way. It brought everything to a screeching halt, and it killed the crowd for a while. Even if they were working the people so they could build to a dramatic standoff a minute or so later, there are other ways they could have worked around that. I would have cut that spot out. Do something else that doesn't involve completely taking the energy out of the room because, trying to get people to think somebody's seriously hurt. Those angles always rub me the wrong way. I wish they would do away with that spot. I see it way too often anymore. But of course, it builds to the big face-off. Both teams are selling the exhaustion. They can barely stand up. And this is where things got interesting because they're going at it in the third fall. But the announcers are also talking about how we're closing in on hour 2 of the show. And that's when, right around that same time, you hear Dasha get on the house mic and say that there are 5 minutes left in the match. And that was actually kind of clever, because when she said that, you could almost hear like an audible groan in the crowd. You know, the fans have sort of been conditioned to think, oh, great, here we go. They're doing the countdown thing for the time limit draw, so evidently they're going to the time limit and we're not going to get a decisive winner. Now, of course, I'm thinking to myself, well, hold on a sec. How exactly do you do a time limit draw in a 2 out of 3 falls match? Has that ever been done before? I don't think I've ever seen it. I don't know how you would fit that into a stipulation match like this. Do they just end the match? Is there a 5-minute grace period? Seems a bit odd to have a draw in a 2 out of 3 falls match. But that tied in perfectly with the finish, as FTR have Juice and Jay in the double sharpshooter. And the fans are pleading and screaming for these motherfuckers to tap. Probably saying, we got 90 seconds, guys. Tap, you sons of bitches. We want a clean finish in this match. And of course, FTR sell the legs giving out on them as they try to apply more pressure with the holds. And they end up doing this kind of clever finish where Dax lowers the knee pad. Juice tags back in, and he also has his knee pad lowered. Can't remember whether or not he did that himself, but it led to a spot where Dax ends up trapping Juice in the sharpshooter, and because of the exposed knee, it not only allowed Dax to sit down more on the small of his back without putting extra pressure on his knee, but Juice also had the knee exposed with no cushioning or padding, so it added more pressure to his knees. And that basically forced the tap-out submission to give FTR the win. Okay. It worked. And with about 80 seconds or so left to go in regulation, the fans were at least pleased they got a clean finish. But it was a great babyface win on top of that. So I guess you could call that a double whammy. And you know, above all else, let me say this. The one thing that really stood out to me watching FTR in this match, am I the only one that's noticing how motivated these guys look? They just look like they're having so much fun out there. They realize they're not getting swept up into the EVP drama. They're finally getting a chance to be properly showcased and featured like a top tag team again. Not being the supporting act on the Wednesday show or getting thrust into the background like ordinary job guys. You know, watching them in this match, it's like the first time in a long time I can actually recall these guys looking like they were having a good time. Is this in contention for another match of the year candidate? I would think so. Certainly if you're a fan of this kind of wrestling, it is. I'd maybe even go as far as to say this is the best tag match I've ever seen in AEW, period. I mean, that trio series they had with the Briscoes last year was phenomenal. But in terms of like an overall well-packaged program where you weren't just relying on the quality of the matches, but you had real drama and story built into the feud, I mean, for sure, this outclasses the 2 FTR matches with the Beta Bucks. You know, the problem with the Briscoes matches is that they never really spent time on AEW television drawing attention to the issues between the 2 teams. Mostly we were just kind of hanging our hat on the quality of the matches. And yeah, they were great, but you didn't have much to go on beyond that. These 2 consecutive matches FTR have had with Juice and Jay, they're among some of the better modern tag matches I can recall in a long time. Maybe even dating back as far as when they were in NXT, having those matches with Gargano and Ciampa. Or what was that team Chad Gable was a part of? Him and that Jason Jordan fella, whose career was unfortunately short-lived. But that goes a ways back. I mean, that's when they weren't even wrestling as Dax and Cash. Whatever their WWE names were at the time. I tried to erase those from memory because they were so horrible. The Revival was a good team name, but the individual names, not so much. The point to all this, fucking great stuff. And now the problem, what now? Where do you go from there? God, they threw everything in the kitchen sink at this one match. Is there even room to do a third match? What's left to do? Aside from boiling the other team alive in a vat of lava. I mean, I don't really see the need to go to a rubber match immediately. It's not to say they couldn't revisit the feud later on, but why rush into the third match? You know, give us a break and let this kind of simmer for a little bit to maybe reheat it later on. Maybe you do the third match at Wembley at the end of August once we've been given a small break. Because I'll tell you, man, if there was a place to do that rubber match, that'd be the environment for it. The only problem is, how are the EVPs going to react to it? And again, this kind of goes back to the conversation I've had about how AEW Collision factors into their ongoing pay-per-view models. Doing high-quality matches like this on free television is great, but what are you saving room for? Is there something bigger you're building toward that you would want people to pay to see? FTR versus Juice and J3 at either the Wembley show or the All Out pay-per-view in September. Those are the ideal locations to do the final blow-off. But again, with the hostile nature of AEW's locker room right now, especially at the upper echelon of things, how's that going to work? You know, unless AEW plans on doing some kind of roster brand pay-per-view in 2024 where, like, the Dynamite Gang gets their own select amount of pay-per-views a year and the Collision folks get theirs. I don't know how any of that would work. But it's something we ought to keep in the back of our minds. Because here's the thing you have to keep in mind. AEW Collision is doing a lot of great pay-per-view quality matches on free TV right now. But the thing is, they're happening in rapid-fire succession. We're only 4 weeks into this thing, and they've thrown a lot of content out there. And it makes you wonder if that's being deliberately done with the expectation that we're not going to get to see a lot of these talents wrestle on AEW pay-per-views. Lots of potential things to think about. But that wasn't the only issue they were dealing with on this show. Because after that instant classic, they basically had an hour left where the remaining talent book for the show had to try and top that. Spoiler, nothing came close. Not even in the same stratosphere. I actually kind of felt bad for Ruby No-Go and Willow Nightingale. Talk about getting the proverbial middle finger. All right, FTR, Jay, and Juice just had the best tag match in company history. Ruby, Willow, good the fuck luck. The boys may as well have just pissed at their feet before they went out there. Now, I'll be honest with you. I had this on in the background, but I really wasn't paying all that close attention to it. And that wasn't strictly because it was a girls' match, although that played a large part. I just knew they were doomed from the start. They could have gone out there and had the best women's match in the last 10 years. It still was never going to come close to topping the previous match. So I was coming and going while the match was happening. More coming than going, if you know what I'm saying. And, now I remember Willow won, if that accounts for anything. Cool. Okay. I mean, I already had little interest in this women's Owen Hart tournament to begin with. The match I saw Ruby and Britt have the other week was really not good. But I've heard some people put over Willow and talk about how she actually has some potential. All right, whatever. Not my flavor personally, but at this stage, anything is better than pushing the fucking outcasts. Speaking of things that aren't my flavor, and I wish AEW would stop pushing, the House of Drek beat 2 job guys in a 3-minute squash. Good for them. I got more use out of going out to the parking lot to throw my trash in the dumpster. And then, boy howdy, Wouldn't you know it? By the time I came back, we were already getting preset for the main event. The finals of the Men's Owen Hart Tournament. Ricky Starks versus CM Punk. And this one had me hooked from the fallout from last week. I wanted to see if and how Samoa Joe was going to get factored into the equation here. I mean, he choked out Punk at the end of last week's program after he lost in the semifinal round. He's been on a path of destruction lately. Kind of an unhinged badass running around and laying waste to everybody. So you had a bit of a story attachment here. Would Joe somehow get involved and screw Punk over? But of course, that wasn't the only thing going on here in terms of a story. At least up until the last 5 seconds, we were basically going into this thing under the assumption that it was a babyface match. Now, there was that sliver of doubt they planted last week where Starks came out for that confrontation with Punk and he just kind of looked a little ambiguous. Kind of like you knew something was coming. And for the most part, they worked it like a babyface match. Now, the problem is that Punk was getting significantly healed the longer the match went. But again, and I talk about the genius of Punk's ring style and how it fits so perfectly in today's modern era because he's able to play off of it and he's able to work the crowd without going full-blown dirtbag. I mean, the middle portion he largely controlled. But, you know, it's actually kind of similar to that Brett 1-2-3 Kid match we reviewed on Retro Raw the other week where even though it was a babyface match and Brett was working over Waltman for large portions of that match, he wasn't necessarily getting the heat. He was just being overly assertive and working the physical Bret Hart style. But it wasn't anything out of the ordinary from what we would regularly see in a babyface Bret match. Punk kind of works the same way. He did all his usual stuff, but he just wasn't showboating to the crowd as much. Because he knew he wasn't going to be able to turn them in his favor. And that's fine. You know, he kept the attack going on Starks. He worked a physical, hard-hitting style. And it works for him. You know that Punk grew up idolizing Bret and watched his tapes. So he knew how to fit that into a match like this where the crowd was not going to be very receptive toward him. But he wasn't going to try to work against the grain. He was just going to run with it. He did the same thing at the Forbidden Door pay-per-view and probably had one of the better matches on that card. Now, the match he had with Ricky here, it wasn't the cleanest match in the world, but it worked for what it was designed to do. You know, I think what everyone's going to get hung up on is the finish, though, so may as well just kind of cover that. We did not get the Joe run-in, but we did get a rather uncharacteristic thing from Ricky here, where as they're trading roll-ups at the end, Ricky waited until the late 2 count to reach out and grab the ropes for leverage. So not only does he win the Owen Hart Foundation tournament, but he does so in rather suspect fashion. Which is good in the sense that it leaves us a cliffhanger for next week's show, as we try to get inside Ricky's head to figure out what his thought process was there. Is it a direct heel turn? Or was it a desperation ploy for Ricky because he had no other alternatives? Good question. And again, they're throwing some surprises at me. So I appreciate that they're keeping things up in the air. They're tying shows together and making sure that every episode gives you something to latch onto for the next week. It's what a lot of people usually coin episodic television. For me, I hate using that in the context of pro wrestling because it gives it too much of a sitcom vibe. But in terms of what they're doing with trying to hook everybody on to next week's show, give them something to think about and stew on for 7 days, they're doing a very effective job at that. You know, I think when I look back, the only thing I didn't like about this was that after Ricky won, we never got to see the trophy presentation. Probably because they ran out of airtime, and that sucks. You know, they could have milked that for another 3 or 4 minutes with having Punk confront Ricky afterwards, you know, try to ask him what the fuck that cheap win was all about, and then he could really heat things up before they fade to black. You know, Ricky could start calling him out saying, "You're stealing my thunder," making it all about you. And they could have cut some promos on each other, but here we just kind of got, boom, Ricky wins. See you next week, folks. Raw rolls on. Cut. I didn't like that. But again, they're giving me reasons to care. It's really not that hard, but they're doing a lot of positive things right now. The necessary changes that a lot of disgruntled AEW fans have been craving, we're getting a lot of it. They still got some chinks in the armor they need to work out, but the positive steps are certainly outweighing the negatives right now. I think the formatting of the show is great in the sense that they're always giving us at least one featured attraction match for the show. They're not throwing out everything under the sun, but at the same time, it's not just a bunch of meaningless squashes. It's kind of similar to the Retro Raw format from the 90s, where you get a quality main event match advertised for the show. Quality by 1994 standards, but you know what I mean. And then you get a few underneath squashes to kind of round out the card. It's simple but effective. I think it'd be better served for them to strategize that around a 60-minute program instead of a 2-hour program. But for right now, the formula works. Now, they'll probably need to modify things as we see the show evolve. They got plenty of star power and plenty of things to work with for the short term. I like the consistency with being able to see a lot of the same names every week. People don't randomly appear and disappear for 8 months at a time. Like I said, they got a lot of things working in their favor right now. It's not to guarantee this Saturday show is going to be a raging success in the next 2 to 3 years, but it's definitely a good counterbalance to Wednesday night whack-a-mole, where everything is just throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. But we'll see. We will see. And on that note, I think we can round things out for this show. So as always, appreciate the people that stick around to watch the show every week. This Friday, we got the normal Dynamite and Classic review schedule. And I think we're pretty much running with that format until the SummerSlam show, which is coming up relatively soon. I kind of need to keep that on my radar. But we'll just keep sticking with the Friday format for now. You know, Dynamite is train wreck television, but doesn't mean that we can't get something of value out of it every week. Well, value in air quotes. Entertainment value. We'll run with that. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Subscribe, comment, rate, all that good stuff. And catch you on the flip side. Peace out.